Dick Schwartz, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back, Dan. Like I just said, I really enjoyed the last time. So
I did too, and your work has had a big influence on my own thinking and my own work. So it's a pleasure to talk to you again.
Oh, I'm very honored to hear that. I didn't realize that, so I'm really grateful.
So I want to talk about your new book, but just I thought maybe it would make sense to start with a refresher on IFS, internal family systems. Let me hand you the mic and you can just walk us through the basics of it.
There's a couple big pieces to it. So one, in contrast to the most common way of understanding the mind, which is to think of it as unitary, I believe it's the natural state of the mind to be multiple, and that people with that diagnosis of multiple personality are no different from anybody else, except that their system got blown apart more by the horrific trauma they suffered. But the idea that we all have these little inner beings, these little inner personalities, is, for me, a natural state of the mind. And that they also, before they're hurt or when they're not hurt, they're incredibly valuable. Each of them are there for a good reason. They have talents and resources to help us in our lives. But that trauma and what's called attachment injuries, which is basically bad parenting, and all the things we suffer, especially when we're kids, force them out of their naturally valuable states into roles that can be quite destructive in our lives, and freeze them in time so that many of these parts, if I were to have you ask a part of you, like a critic or something, how old it thought you were, most people get a single digit. They still think you're 5 or 6, and they still have to protect you in the way they did back then. So they get frozen in time, and they take in what I call burdens, which are the extreme beliefs and emotions that came into you during the trauma, and then graft onto them and then drive the way they operate, like a virus might. So that's the state of most of our parts. When we, at least the ones that I tend to work with, because I'm a therapist, I'm trying to help people with the parts that are getting in their way. The other couple of pieces of this, because I come from a family therapy background, I had 2 advantages. One is I didn't know anything about intrapsychic work, psychoanalysis, or any of that. So when clients started talking about this back in the early 80s, these parts, I really just had to listen and try to understand what they were saying rather than impose a theory on them. So, and the second advantage I had is from family therapy, I was a systems thinker. So in families, we would track the interactions of family members with each other and then try to make a map of who's allied to whom and who's polarized with whom. And you can do that. And with that map, then we would know where to go to try and intervene. So I began doing that with these parts. I wasn't interested in each one individually, but how do they relate to each other as a system? And a map I came up with ultimately, which is held up as this very useful map over these 40 years, is that there are these, other systems would call them inner children, these young, vulnerable parts of us who are very sensitive, but also when they're not hurt, are playful and joyful and creative and loving, and we love them because they're our most precious qualities a lot of the time. But they're the ones, because they're most sensitive, that get hurt the most. They take on the burden of terror from some trauma, or the burden of worthlessness and shame, or the burden of emotional pain. And then once they carry that and they're stuck in those scenes, we don't want to be around them anymore because they have the power to overwhelm us with those feelings and pull us back into those scenes. And so we have almost natural instinct to lock those parts away. And our culture tells us to do that. This is a just move on, don't look back kind of culture. So we try to move on from the memories and the emotions of the trauma, but not realizing that we're also moving away from the parts of us that were hurt the most. So we call those exiles. And when you do that, not only do those parts get hurt because you've abandoned them, but you lose contact with those wonderful qualities they carry. And so most of us growing up in this culture have a bunch of exiles. And when you have a bunch of those kind of raw, vulnerable parts, you feel more delicate because so many things could trigger that. And the world seems more dangerous because so many things could trigger it. And so other parts are forced out of their naturally valuable states to become protectors. And some of them are trying to protect you by managing your life so that your exiles don't get triggered. So they'll manage your relationships so no one gets close enough to hurt you again, or they'll try to make you look perfect so no one rejects you, or they'll try to make you achieve at a high level to counter the worthlessness, or they make you take care of everybody so that they depend on you, they don't leave you, don't let you take care of yourself. So these are just some of the common, what I call manager protector roles that otherwise people call the ego, basically. But they have in common the desire to keep you safe and in control and to please people, mainly so that you can not get triggered. But these exiles don't burst out with their flames of raw emotion. Now, it doesn't always work, and the world has a way of breaking through those defenses and triggering your exiles. And when that happens, that's a big emergency because it feels like these raw flames of emotion are going to take you out. And for many of the people I work with, they do. When you get really triggered, you can't function. And some people are in bed for a week and so on. So it's all very real. So there are other parts who are kind of on standby, waiting to deal with this explosion of flames of emotion by either getting you higher than those flames or dousing them with some substance or distracting you until they burn themselves out. So we call those firefighters. And so that's the map. It's pretty simple. Exiles, and then two different kinds of protectors. One, the managers who are trying to preempt anything that might trigger the exiles. And then the firefighters who react after the fact, after an exile has been triggered. And in contrast to the managers who are careful and try to keep you in control and please people, these firefighters don't care about the consequences to your body, to your relationships. They just got to get you away from those feelings right now, no matter what it takes. And so there's built-in polarizations inside of us also between the part that when you feel that wants to get you drunk and then the part that attacks you for being a drunk and so on. That's the map of the parts, but actually the big deal about IFS, and I think this is very related to your work, is that in addition to these parts, there's a kind of essence in people that I call the self with a capital S. And I just stumbled onto that discovery back in the day, a long time ago, because as a family therapist, once I got hip to the fact these parts weren't what they seemed and they needed to be listened to rather than fought with, I would try to get clients to do that. And so maybe I'm having you try to get to know your critic and get curious about it rather than hate it. And you're doing that and you're listening to the critic and it's telling you about how it's trying to protect you by running down your confidence so you don't take risks, or by pushing you to achieve more, or so, there's always a positive intention, even though often it backfires. So I'm trying to get you to listen and even extend some appreciation to this part that you've hated. And then suddenly the part that hates it has jumped in and is doing the talking. And so things go south. And it reminded me of family sessions where I'm trying to have two family members talk to each other, and a third member comes in and sides with one against the other, and it goes south. And I began asking clients, could you find the part that hates the critic or is afraid of it, or whatever part you're working with has got an attitude about? And could you ask that one to give us the space to just get to know this one we're trying to work with? And to my amazement, when these other parts would separate, It was like some other person popped out and would do the talking and had these qualities that were really useful, like was calm, where seconds earlier they were really agitated, or had confidence relative to the part, or was just purely curious about it. And also often would suddenly become compassionate toward it. And in that state, whatever part, the critic, let's say, would drop its guard and would really respond well. And then the client would basically take over the session and would know how to relate in a healing way to this part. And when I would do that with other clients, it was like the same person would pop out with those same C-word qualities: calm, confident, compassion, curiosity, but also would be clear. The image would change, or would be courageous and could go to places that couldn't before, or would be creative in how they related to the part or feel connected to it. And when I would ask people, what part of you is that? That's great. Let's keep that around. They'd say some version of, that's not a part like these others. That's myself. So that's why I came to call that the self with a capital S. And now, 40 years later, we can safely say that that self is in everybody, can't be damaged, knows how to heal, and is just beneath the surface of these parts, such that when they open space, it pops out spontaneously. And so that's the big deal about IFS. That's what I'm trying to bring to the culture, is this kind of different understanding of human beings and the mind that is much more uplifting, actually.
There, you said a lot there, so I'm going to try to sum it up, although it's a lot to sum up. But essentially, the IFS model says we all have these different modes, these different aspects of our personality: angry, jealous, happy, creative, ashamed, whatever. And you refer to these as parts. Mm-hmm. Sometimes these parts get inflamed, exacerbated through the trauma of our lives, and we try to compartmentalize or shut them out because it's too painful to handle. At that point, the part becomes an exile.
That's correct.
At which point we see the emergence of two, you might call, protector parts: the manager, often an inner critic who's kind of like a sheepdog, trying to keep everybody in line to manage things so that the exiles don't grab the mic, and alternatively the firefighter, who's much less regulated and will try to douse the flames with alcohol or shopping or gambling or whatever it is. Both are trying to manage the exile in different ways. The route to sanity is to, first of all, to recognize that we have all of these parts, and then, to the best of your ability, to relate to them from what you're calling the capital S self. I know we talked about this last time, but I think it's worth bringing up again. What is the link for you between what you're calling the capital S self and what in Buddhism we would call not self? Like, our core is that we have no core.
Right.
That the self, the idea that there's some core Dan behind my eyes, between my ears, that's an illusion. In fact, a really harmful illusion. Whereas you're pointing to this capital S self as being the point of origination for healing.
So I've had many of these conversations with Buddhists, and what we can usually come to is it's linguistic. So what they're calling self is really what I'm calling parts. No self in Buddhism is really the absence of these sometimes extreme voices and parts that are cluttering your mind. And as you get them to open space inside, you find this kind of calm essence that people call no self in Buddhism, but for me is really the self with a capital S. So that's where I've come to reconcile it.
And for somebody who's having, I can imagine at this point listeners being a little confused, and I'm probably part of the problem because I brought in this hard to understand concept of no self. But just again, very simply, your concept of the self is the best part of us, the sanest, calmest, clearest, most compassionate aspect of the human mind.
Yeah, and it's It's our essence, actually. It's who we are when all these parts separate. And it has these great C-word qualities that I just mentioned and some other kinds of qualities. And for me, and this is related to your work too, I think, when I encountered it in people, I couldn't reconcile its existence because I'd been trained in what's called attachment theory to believe that to have any of that inside, you had to have gotten it from a relationship. So as a child, you needed to have gotten it from good enough parenting. If you didn't get it there, you had to get it from a therapist. And if you didn't get it there, you had to get it from a spouse or someplace. And I was working with people who had been horribly abused on a daily basis as children. And so there was no way I could reconcile encountering this in them with that theory. So it wasn't until I started and I was sort of directed to look into spirituality that I could ground that observation. Because like you were saying about Buddhism, virtually every spiritual tradition has a word for this, and almost no other psychologies do. So in Buddhism, it's not only no self, but it's also Buddha nature. And in Christianity, it would be Christ consciousness. In Hinduism, it's Atma. In Judaism, it's Nefesh, and so on. I actually co-authored a book where we went through each tradition and identified that essence that we were finding in us and how they describe it in very similar ways. But I was finding that we could access that very quickly in people, even people who've been horribly traumatized, in contrast to a lot of those traditions where you have to meditate 20 years to get to it. For me, it is the same, and it is a kind of drop of a bigger ocean. So the model in my own thinking has much more evolved in a spiritual direction that way. That there is this big self that others have other names for, that you can access through meditation, you can access through psychedelics, and that, this is a particle of that big wave or a drop of that big ocean.
Yeah, there's a whole debate here that I don't think we should have about big self, because I think there are some in the Buddhist world, including many of my own teachers, who would say, as long as you're identifying with anything, you're suffering. But let me set that aside and go to this notion of, in the later schools of Buddhism, of a Buddha nature, which, as you said, there are names for this in many spiritual traditions. My understanding is this kind of gets us into the debate of like, what is fundamental about human nature? Are we red in tooth and claw? Are we rotten root and branch? Or are we essentially good? And I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is there are some data coming out of the sciences indicating that actually, like in our rawest state, if you look at a baby, for example, and put in front of a baby like a mean character or a nice character, they'll very naturally gravitate toward the nice character. Or if you have a baby or a toddler in the room and somebody participating in the experiment pantomimes being in pain, they will naturally express concern and try to help. So there are some indications that this idea of a Buddha nature or an essential goodness doesn't require exogenous factors like good parenting. It's just in us.
Yeah. So I'm just finishing reading for the second time a book by a guy named Rutger Bregman called Humankind, where he goes through all the data there is to show that we've been laboring under this misconception about what people are really like. And we do have this really good essence. So I'd recommend that.
I wrote it down.
Includes the research you're talking about.
Yeah, maybe a guest on this show. I do want to get to the practical, because that's what the subject, that's the subject of your new book. But just to stay on with the sort of esoterica for a second, when you talk about managers and firefighters, again, just to refresh people's memories, that these are the parts that we develop to keep our shit together. In the case of the manager, often the manager manifests as a kind of inner critic, keeping you in line. And then the firefighter is kind of a wanton, reckless pain relief, often, just let's save us from the exiled, unwanted parts of ourselves by drowning it in some sort of dopamine ocean. It reminds me a little bit, especially the managers. And here's where I could probably get myself in trouble with Buddhist scholars, but to the very small extent to which I understand protector deities within Tibetan Buddhism, I'm wondering whether there's some overlap there.
I think so. Yeah, I've been collaborating a little bit with Sultra Malioni. Do you know that name?
Mm-mm.
She wrote a book called Feeding Your Demons. And she's a Tibetan Lama. And that's where we've come to some agreement that those demons, they call them, are really just these protective parts. And that rather than fight with them, feed them and help them calm down and relax and transform. So, yeah, I agree with that.
It's so interesting. She has this term, feeding your demons. I kind of independently arrived. Well, independently, nothing's independent in a codependent universe, or an interdependent universe. I've started using the term high-fiving your demons.
It's great.
Because, and I've learned this from you, and I've also learned it through the work of Kristen Neff and others involved in self-compassion. And of course, in my Buddhist practice and studies, I think my traditional approach and the approach of many people is to use the managers or the firefighters to keep the exiles at bay. And it's pretty hostile. Whereas if you blow them a kiss or give them a high five or feed them, not in the sense of indulgence,
exactly,
but in a sense of like, thank you. I recognize that these exile parts, or even the managers I may not like, are essentially, as you said before, the organism trying to protect itself. We develop these habits and patterns often for very good reasons, but they're not skillful. If you welcome them to the party and give them a party hat and let them sit at the table, they often get quite compliant.
That is part of what I'm trying to bring. I actually could reference a book, because we're talking so much about Buddhism, that just came out called Outshining Trauma by a guy named Ralph de la Rosa. And it's all about IFS and Buddhism. And one of the big pieces of it is that there's been such an attitude about the ego, quote unquote, in so many Buddhist traditions. And we're really trying to get Buddhists to do what you're talking about, which is to love them up. And if you do that instead of trying to shoo them away, these parts, that you get much more cooperation in your meditation.
Yes. What I realized doing high-dose loving-kindness meditation, where you flood the mind with warmth, often in a very kind of, it can feel quite forced or treacly or saccharine, this practice. But what I realized after I got over myself and allowed myself to do it at a high dosage was, as my demons, let's call them that, or my parts, whatever you want to say, were emerging in my practice, I was meeting them with more warmth. And I was realizing that my mindfulness practice heretofore was shot through with aversion.
Totally.
And aversion is, in Buddhist speak, a hindrance. You don't, if you're actually feeling aversion towards something, you're not truly being mindful of it. So mindfulness, properly understood, self-awareness, properly understood, contains in it a kind of mixture of warmth and non-judgmentalism. I was practicing mindfulness improperly up until that point, really.
Maybe. I mean, I've just run into many Buddhist teachings that actually encourage you to do it that way. So, so this is revolutionary in the Buddhist world. And another woman named Lama Willa Baker has really transformed her teaching around that. And it's hard to be loving and compassionate to this ego that gets vilified in Buddhism. It's a lot easier if you think of them as these little inner beings who are trying their best to keep you safe. And sometimes they're misguided. So how you think of this makes a big difference in how you can relate to them.
Again, I'm going to promise that we're going to get to the practical stuff very soon.
I'm really okay. I'm loving this conversation. So whatever we want to do is fine with me.
It's
really
more.
okay.
That's more me talking to the listener than it is talking to you. But as a point of personal privilege, just taking advantage of abusing my role of host to ask some shit that is interesting, perhaps only to me. This is truly self-indulgent, what I'm about to ask. So I've been working on my own book for, as listeners know, for 6.5 years now. And one of my struggles is I don't know if I can clearly articulate the thesis, but let me try and see how it lands for you. For me, I've been struck hosting the show, 700 interviews, 8 years, that there's this whole very interesting body of research and practice around how you relate to yourself. And I would put in that bucket IFS, self-compassion, Ethan Kross's work about, rewiring your inner chatter. There's a ton of work around, you might call it self-love, writ large, just relating to yourself in a more skillful way. Simultaneously, there's this whole other body of work on, let's call it social fitness. So guys like Robert Waldinger and many other researchers, Barbara Fredrickson, who's looked at micro interactions, who've correctly diagnosed that humans are social species, and yet nobody teaches us how to relate to other members of Homo sapiens. There are communication skills. There are the skills related to empathy and compassion, intellectual humility, all of this science and practice around getting along better with other people. And so I'm interested in combining these two things because there is data to show that if you are cooler with yourself, your relationships with other people will improve. And because your relationships with other people are the most important variable in human flourishing, according to the data that I've seen, then your inner weather gets even better and you're on this upward spiral. Roughly speaking, I can't think of any better word to describe this whole amalgamation of skills and science than just love as an omnidirectional force that applies outward and inward. So that's basically what I'm trying to talk about in this book. And you're an actual expert. I'm just a guy. How does all of that sound to you?
That sounds great. I would tweak it a little if you're okay with that.
Please.
So for me, there are these two schools in Buddhism. Some Buddhist practices fall into one of those, which is you have to build up the muscle of compassion and love, and it takes a lot of practice and work. And then there's where I come from, which is much more what we call a constraint releasing approach that says it's all in there. And the goal is to release it. You don't have to build it up, because once you get to it, you know from self, what I call self, how to relate to people in a good way. It's just innate in us. So the goal becomes to find the parts and the burdens they carry and unburden those parts so that they don't close your heart. They don't keep your heart closed all the time. And then you just are in this other state a lot of your life. And so I hope you can understand the distinction I'm trying to make. So rather than building up these qualities through practice, we're just kind of we're helping to find the obstacles to them, and then helping those parts trust it's safe to release that. And one of the problems I have with the other approach is that as you try to, and you said it's a lot of work, as you try to have all this compassion for yourself and others, many people with a lot of trauma have trouble with that. They have parts that swore they would never feel compassion and for another person or from certain other parts of themselves. And so you're trying to bypass those parts, and they'll keep interfering. But if you go to those parts and you help them, and you go to them with compassion, and you help them understand the larger project and help them get on board with it, then you don't have to work to have compassion. It's just natural. And the other thing I would say, because I do agree with this, what you were saying, that if you can have compassion for all parts of you, then when other people act like those parts in the outside world, you can have compassion for them. But if you hate certain parts of you, or you are afraid of certain parts, when those people act that way, you're going to have that reaction to them as well. So that's how the inside and outside play out in IFS.
Meditation is not just a quick fix. It is a practice to change all parts of your life, and you don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up. The Happier Meditation app meets you where you are so you can realize more than you thought possible with a flexible approach that grows with you and wisdom from some of the world's most insightful teachers. Happier helps you get more out of meditation so you can give more to every part of your life. Go to happierapp.com and start meditating in a way that truly fits you. Yeah, just to pick up on the latter point, and we can get back to the former point about the work model and versus the sort of IFS model. And I don't even know if I'm putting the right terms on it. But on the latter part about your relationship to yourself redounding to how you are with the world, this is a less catchy term, but I kind of think of it as like a contact theory. Most of us spend most of our time at a limited number of regions in the brain, often referred to as the default mode network. We're just chattering to ourselves, judging, thinking about the past, thinking about the future, keeping at bay the parts of our personality that you call the exiles that we don't want to deal with. And also keeping at bay much of the world, not really wanting to deal with other people's difficult stuff, not really wanting to, especially now the whole world militates against contact because we're further and further in our distraction devices and our information silos. I kind of think of what I'm calling love as just a way out of the default mode network, or what David Foster Wallace, the unfortunately departed novelist, called the skull-sized kingdom. We're just stuck in these shells, as opposed to, one way to put it, and you used this term earlier. I don't love this terminology, but I think there's probably some part of me that is stopping me from loving this terminology, but opening your heart.
Yeah. You want me to react to that? Yeah. So
you can call me a dummy, whatever reaction is, it's all safe here, Dick.
Okay, good. Well, you're not a dummy, and I agree with what you're saying, basically. Luckily for you, I agree with what you just said. When people are dominated by these protectors, which would be, and I want to make it clear that the protectors are not their roles. They're very valuable parts that get forced into these roles. It's not their nature. And they'll transform as you help them. But most of us are dominated to some degree or another by managers, most through our getting us through our day. And then we have these reactive firefighters when they're necessary. But they all operate in the default mode network. And so for me, the brain is just a tool that these parts use. It's not that that's what it is. It's not that that's where the juice is if we were to try and change things. Because I hope someday to do the brain scan research where I can show, because, my friend Bessel Vanderkolk has these great slides where traumatized people are just offline, basically. For me, that's because a dissociative part has taken over that part of their brain. And if we can get that one to lighten up, you'll see a totally different brain scan. So I hope I'm being clear about what I'm saying. But yeah, for me, it's all parts, and people think I'm obnoxious for that reason. But
you don't scan as obnoxious to me. Let me get back to the other point you were making earlier about your beef with Buddhism, as you understand it, is that there can be in some precincts of the Dharma a focus on do the work to feel compassion, as opposed, do this specific kind of meditation, and people can feel dysfunctional because they're not feeling any compassion, but they're doing all this work. Whereas the work that you would recommend is let's remove the obstacles, as opposed to, just grinding away.
Transform the obstacles.
Yes, right. Yeah. To me, and to the extent that I understand any of this, the way it's worked for me personally is both learning to high five or feed my demons, while also doing these ancient practices that in a very awkward, cultish way do boost my mind's capacity to, it boosts my friendliness quotient over time.
Yeah, I don't want to be quite so black and white about it. I did TM, for example, for like 8 years after college, and was very insecure, really thought I had no talents and felt lot of worthlessness from my family. And it was really helpful. And the meditative practice got me more in touch with what I was calling that big self. I wasn't so caught up in all the worthless parts and the parts that were so critical and so on. And I could function much better. And I was using the meditation to stay away from my exiles. So they weren't getting the benefit of all of this. So I was feeling better. I could function better. I had more compassion for other people, but my exiles were feeling even more abandoned. And it wasn't until I ran into I kind of discovered IFS that I realized what I was doing, and that I then, I used some of that access to what I had gotten through meditation, and then brought that to the exiles and helped them feel the love that I could give them then. So I'm not trying to be so black and white about it, but I'm a crusader for not doing the spiritual bypass, and for actually going to these raw places and helping them out of where they're stuck in the past.
Let's talk about the how-to here, because as I understand it, the purpose of your new book is, look, the IFS is you have a lot of faith in it, and I know a lot of people who've gotten a lot out of it as a form of therapy that you do with a trained IFS therapist. But not everybody has access to this for either cost reasons or any other reason. Maybe we don't have time to do it. And so you've developed this workbook that allows us to practice this skill on our own. So let me stop there and let you just say, like, well, how can we even start making peace with our parts without a therapist in the room with us?
It's taken me this 40 years to actually free myself up to bring it directly to the public, because it is possible to go to these very, scary, raw places through the process of the model. And if you don't have somebody with you who knows what to do when you're in there, it can get very scary. So I've always, until now, shied away from bringing it directly to the public. But in working with that, I realized there's a certain amount of IFS that people can do very safely on their own. They can't do the full Monty, and that's why they're a therapist. But if the workbook is designed to help people get to know and honor and help these protectors trust self-leadership. And that's quite safe. You can do that without a lot of extreme reactions as you go. It's when you start heading toward these exiles that it gets dicey. And so the advice in the book is do what you can with your protectors. You run into an exile, let it know you get it, that you care about it, you want to help it, and then go find a therapist who can help you do that piece. And then come back, and there's a lot of exercises for how to maintain that and keep everything going. So that's where we are. It feels like it's time to bring this to the public directly, and we're doing it through this book. I was just yesterday talking to Gabby Bernstein, do you know Gabby?
I know who she is, Gabrielle Bernstein. She's a writer.
Gabrielle Bernstein. So she's releasing a book next month on her journey with IFS that's very, very disclosive. It's a really good book, and it's for the public. And we're playing with AI apps to try and bring it more directly to the public. So it just feels like the time has come to make it more available to people that can't afford therapy, or even people that can, who want to do a lot on their own.
Okay, so let's be quite granular, practical with somebody listening to this who wants to just try it while they're doing their household chores or driving their car, listening to this just to get it so they can get a toehold in what we're talking about here. I'll throw something out as a conversation starter where you can push it away and go in whatever direction you want. But you talk about these 6 steps of find, focus, flesh out, feel toward, befriend, and fear. Would that be a good place to start if we want to give people very basic instructions?
Very much. And, I know you were a good sport last time, but if you're interested, I could do a little piece with one of your protectors, so
Great.
the audience would get a sense of how it goes.
Okay.
Yeah, is there a part you'd like to start with?
Well, the part we worked with last time is I call him RJ, which is my grandfather's initials, Robert Johnson, who is, I would say, the inner critic manager. So we talked to him last time. The other part that I've named may be closer to an exile. I don't know, but maybe I don't know. You'll tell me where it fits in the he fits in the taxonomy. I call him Arthur because my great grandfather on the other side of the family. So RJ is from the waspy Christian side of the family, and Arthur's from the Jewish side of the family. Arthur was this hustler who arrived here from Eastern Europe or Russia in the early 1900s and was basically a criminal and got busted and took his own life in the family home, creating incalculable waves of trauma. And that kind of hustler mode, fear-based hustling, I really see that in myself. I have a lot of not very rational anxiety around money and achievement and things like that. And so maybe since RJ got the love last time, we can go at Arthur. I don't know where he fits in your taxonomy, though.
Yeah, he would be a protector. And
okay,
you bring up a topic that's really become big in IFS, which is what we call legacy burdens. That anxiety, or that how you described him, may well not have come from your life, from things that happened to you, but that you just absorbed through the generations. And so you ready?
Yes. And if you could be clear, because now I'm basically working with a therapist, if you could be clear as we do this process, how people can do this for themselves, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll do it with you first. We'll do it pretty briefly, and then I'll describe what we did.
Okay.
So focus on Arthur and find him in your body or around your body. Just find his energy or his voice, or however you experience him.
Yeah, it's like malfunctioning gills in the center of my chest, like this kind of beehive energy above the solar plexus.
And as you notice him there, how do you feel toward him? How do you, Dan, feel toward him? Do you like him? Do you hate him? Do you fear him? Okay,
so the first response is it's uncomfortable and kind of annoying and maybe a little embarrassing that I'm such a striver. I'm so sweaty, thirsty, as the kids might say. Mm-hmm. Over time, I've developed a more of an affectionate, all right, yeah, there. I appreciate what you're trying to do.
So let's ask all the parts that are annoyed by him to give us a lot of space to get to know him better. And just see if you can really just get into that curious but appreciative place with him.
Yes, I can do that.
All right, so let him know you feel that way toward him right now and see how he reacts.
Often what I'll say is just thank you.
Great, so do that and see if a reaction comes from him. And don't think, just kind of wait and see if you get some kind of reaction in there.
Yeah, the unfiltered kind of dialogue I heard was him saying, I got you.
Good.
I'm looking out for you.
How did it feel to hear that?
It's great. It's like a buddy doing me a favor.
So tell him you really appreciate it. And ask him what else he wants you to know about himself. Just a very open-ended, curious question. And wait for the answer. Don't think.
The answer that came without thinking was, I do what I have to do.
Okay. And ask him more about what he's afraid would happen if he didn't do that.
It's funny. There was a movie. There was a line in it it's hard out here for a pimp. It's I'm on the streets hustling and I'm doing what I have to do. And that's the energy I get.
Okay, good. Maybe at this point you can ask him if he does carry somebody else's energy. Just ask that question and wait and see what happens.
I don't know if this is authentically what Arthur has to say or my intellect intervening, but to the extent that I understand the history of where Arthur came from,
Okay, but that is your intellect. So
Okay,
we're
there
going to
we go.
ask
So I'll
that.
stop. Yeah.
We're going to ask that thinking part to give us a lot of space, and we're going to go back to Arthur, and we're going to ask him if he carries somebody else's energy. And don't think, just wait and see if an answer comes. If no answer comes, that's fine.
No clear answer came.
Okay, that's fine. So go back to him again and ask what he's afraid would happen if he didn't do this job.
Destitution.
Okay, so he feels like he's keeping you from destitution.
Yes.
And how do you feel toward him as you get that that's what his belief is?
Increasing affection.
So show that to him. And ask him more about why he thinks you would be destitute without him doing this.
That's because he saw it happen in his own life.
Okay, yeah, so this is his energy. And he, in this part, carries Arthur's energy. So let him know you get that he's been coming down to keep you from destitution, and that he actually saw that happen to people he cared about, and maybe to himself.
It's not theoretical.
That's right. It's real. Ask him how old he thinks you are. And again, don't think, just ask.
I don't get a clear answer to that.
All right. Now that you have heard all this from him, and you do have great affection for him, ask him if there's anything he'd like to do different, or if he would like to not have to worry so much about protecting you this way, or anything he'd like you to know about, any shifts he'd like to make.
It's funny. I don't know if this is him talking or my capital S self talking or some other part, but yeah, I get the vibe that he would like to put the burden down and help me avoid what he went through.
Okay, so we do need to know if it's coming from him. So again, ask that thinking part to just give you a lot of space again, and ask him directly if he would like to unload this burden of Arthur's energy. Ask this part if he'd like to not have to carry this.
I think the answer is yes, and I want to be completely honest about. I'm not sure I've been able to get the thinking aspects of my mind out of. Also, there's the self-consciousness too, because I think it's tricky to do the work in public.
Totally, I totally get that too, and we don't have to do much more, but let him know that if he does want to unload that, there's a way that can happen, so that he can do something he would rather do inside of you. We don't have to do it today, and I'm happy to help you do it at some other point privately, but just let him know that that's a possibility whenever he's ready.
This is pure intellect coming in now, I think, but it's something I've thought a lot about. Is I like that I'm ambitious and have a lot of energy and a lot of ideas, and can you have the motivation switch, and I know it's not an overnight thing, but over time, from fear of destitution to love.
That's right. That's what we do. So if he could give up this terror he carries, then he would transform. The part of you that carries that will transform and become a helper, an ally in your goal of leading from love, and yourself knows how to do that. And these parts would come to trust you to lead more without having to strategize and be so slick in how they would do it. So
the way this has worked for me, this is just my experience, is that developing more affection, high-fiving the demons, has not made it so that the terror never comes. I run a small business. It's a rolling existential crisis. Every once in a while, I get an email that it says that has I'll get an email that has let's say scary implications for the balance sheet, and the terror will come. So it's not as if I've transformed the part in a irrevocable way.
Yeah.
But I think generally speaking, I have developed a reflex some significant percentage of the time to see it for what it is and to talk to myself with some warmth.
Yeah, and that's a really good step. But I just want you to know that it is possible to transform the terror, to not have that reaction.
Ever.
Because the unburdening process actually does that. So it's a possibility. And I know that feeling about the small business precipice.
We gave people a little bit of a taste of what it's like to work with a IFS therapist. How can we interpolate that into our own, how can we operationalize that in our own lives, sans therapist?
The book has these exercises that you would do, basically what I had you do, and I'll go through the steps we just went through. So the first of those F words is to focus on the part. And then I had you do that on Arthur, and then find it in your body, around your body. So that's the second F, which you did. And people can do this pretty readily on their own. And then there's that question of how do you feel toward it? So we don't let you interact with it until you do feel some of what you felt, which is minimally curious to get to know it. But you were ahead of the game. You felt appreciation for it and caring for it. You know, you had parts that still had an attitude about it, but we got those out. And so you could be very loving to it. And, you know, it's a testimony to your Buddhist practice that you can have that kind of compassion for parts that before you didn't like. And so I had you let him know that you felt that way toward him. And we did that for a while. So that's another step is, I forget the F word, but befriend it. We're starting to, the F is in the middle of the word. So we're helping you befriend this Arthur part. And you'd already started on that path. And we had you do that until there did seem to be a trust and a connection in your relationship with him. And then I just had you start asking, what does he want you to know about himself? And you got more, I don't know if it's more than you've gotten in the past, but you got some information about how he does carry this terror about destitution, and it's because he saw it happen in the past, and that this part carries his energy and isn't, you know, wouldn't mind not having to carry that. So all of that was part of just asking these questions and waiting for the answer. And in the process, keeping that thinking part from doing the answering so that you're actually, the answers are coming from that place in your body.
Do you recommend that people do this work? And again, now we're talking about outside of a clinical or therapeutic session, that people do this work as a kind of seated meditation, or can it be an on-the-go, free-range thing that happens anytime you notice a part grabbing the steering wheel?
Exactly. It becomes a life practice. So, you know, if I'm out in the world and somebody says something that triggers me, on a good day, I'll do what we call a U-turn in my focus. I'll say, time out for a second. And I'll focus inside. I'll notice the protector that's coming up to defend me. And then I'll get curious about it. I'll ask it to separate. And I can do this in like 10 seconds. And I'll ask about what it's protecting. And I'll learn about the exile that got triggered by this person. And then, depending on the context, I'll either just ask them to give me a little space so I can stay, so myself can stay and handle the person. Or if I'm with my wife or, you know, somebody who I can be vulnerable with, I'll speak for the parts that got triggered. I'll say, when you said that thing, I felt this protector come up and wanted to say this, and I knew that wouldn't help. So I learned it's protecting this other part, and I'm going to do some work so I can heal that one. But I just wanted you to know that what you said had that impact on me. And I would say it from that tone of voice, rather than, why did you say this awful thing?
So I'm trying to think about how I can put this in the simplest possible terms for people who want to do this either in, as a seated formal session or like as you said, a life practice. It's about just working your way through these F's of focus, which basically means paying attention, or, well, I see the 6 steps are find, focus, which seem to be quite similar, just identifying what's happening. Fleshing out and feeling towards seem about like getting curious and understanding. Befriending is the penultimate F, the F being in the middle, like really having a warm relationship. And then the final F is around fear, which is kind of understanding like what is the fear that this part is carrying. So it's really, if you wanted to even whittle it down, it's just about, okay, can I be mindful and self-aware of what's happening right now? Can I enter into a friendly dialogue with it and let the emotion kind of metabolize in that way?
Yeah. Mindfulness is a good first step, but for the difference is IFS, you become not just an observer of your thoughts and emotions, you become an active inner parent or inner attachment figure or inner leader. And you go to them with this, just what you did with Arthur just now. And you express love to them and you help them. And as you do that, you learn that most of them are very young. They're all, even these big-time protectors, are usually no older than a teenager. And they're in over their heads, like parentified children. And they're waiting for some grown-up to come along and say, you don't have to do this. I can handle things. Just let me run things now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The executive coach with whom I've been working for many years is, I don't know if we've ever talked about IFS, but he's very clearly influenced deeply by it. His name is Jerry Colonna, and he often talks about the inner 5-year-old, these neurotic programs we developed as 5, pick an age, that are trying to protect us. I also want to say on a practical tip that I believe you've also recorded guided meditations. Mm-hmm. You spell them out in the book, but I believe there are also recordings of some guided meditations that really walk people through these.
Yeah, very much. I can't remember if we've done that with the workbook, but there on Sounds True published something called Greater Than the Sum of the Parts, which are a collection of my meditations along these lines. And the book No Bad Parts that I wrote a few years ago, the audio version of that has a lot of these meditations too.
And this workbook has them written out. Like there's an inner critic meditation, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly, that's right.
Right. So again, proving the point that while it's great if you have an IFS therapist you can go to, but if you don't have the time or the inclination or the money, there are ways I can listen to Dick Schwartz guide me in meditation, or I can read the meditation instructions and do them for myself. I can even just listen to this conversation and start doing a rough version in my own life.
That's right. Just the act of separating from these protective parts and getting access to yourself changes people's identity, changes their self-concept. To know that, we work with offenders, for example. We're doing a lot of work. We're going to be doing a lot more, but we've been doing work in prisons. And for some of the inmates to learn that the part of them that did the harmful thing isn't who they are. And that part isn't even who they think it is. It's not pure evil at all. It's part that was trying to protect them. And that there is this other person inside of them who's pure goodness. I mean, that by itself has a huge impact on how you view yourself.
There was something you said earlier that I just want to make sure in our remaining time that I get some clarity on. If I'm understanding you correctly, part of your sensitivity about teaching people how to do IFS outside of a clinical setting is that they might bump up against an exile. And if that's true, they should actually go see a therapist, because if I'm understanding you correctly, this is really about working with protector parts like a manager or a firefighter, that it might be too hot to get in touch with an exile. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, pretty close. So inevitably you will, because that question, that last F question of what's the part afraid would happen if it didn't protect you this way? Many people will learn about some vulnerable exile that it protects. So you will run into exiles. What we're saying is before you go on all the healing steps for an exile, of which there are about 5, don't try to do that alone. Don't do this by yourself. But it's fine to show a lot of compassion and love to that exile. Like you said, you still get this terror reaction, but you've learned to not be overtaken by it. You've learned that it's a part, and that you can reassure it. You can love it like a good parent. So that's one of the steps in working with an exile. But then at some point with a therapist, we would have you ask it where it's stuck in the past and show you what happened and let you feel how bad it was. So the part feels witnessed, and then would literally have you, Dan, go into that scene and be with that boy in the way he needed somebody back there, and then take him out to a safe place, which might just be to your lap or to your house, and then help him unload these extreme beliefs and emotions he got from that terror scene. And there's a couple other steps, but it's that's the delicate part that some people can, in an amazing way, do on their own. But some people will get into trouble if they try and do it on their own.
I want to get some clarity for myself, and hopefully this leads to some clarity for the audience on how I can understand the difference between the protector parts and the exile part. So in my case, Arthur, this kind of slightly scammy, hustler, ambitious character that I see in myself, he's a manager or a protector part, but the exile is the fear.
That's right. The exile is the terror. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let me phrase it differently. Like Arthur isn't the sliminess. That's the energy of was it your uncle or who was it? I can't remember.
Maybe great-great-grandfather.
Oh, your great-great-grandfather. That's the energy that part of you carries, but the part itself isn't him. And that's an important distinction. And then the exile is a young, vulnerable part of you that got terrified at some point, probably in your childhood, and carries that terror. But it can unload that terror once it feels safe.
Right. So just to restate that, Arthur may carry some greasy energy, but essentially he's just trying to be protective. That's the essence of him.
That's the essence of him. And once he unburdens, he'll transform into just being an advisor or a different kind of protector.
In our remaining minutes, one last thing I want to ask you about is the book talks about, correct me if I'm wrong, either the book talks about or you've been talking more publicly about, or both, psychedelics. And I'm interested in psychedelics, have been too afraid to really do them. I've done some MDMA, which I'm like, is slightly different in my mind from what I would consider to be the psychedelics that most people think about, like psilocybin and LSD or ayahuasca. I've done MDMA mostly just recreationally, and I think you have to be careful, but for me, it's been really helpful. But what to you is the link between IFS and psychedelics, and how can they be mutually communicative?
Yeah. So, and I agree with that distinction between MDMA and some of the others. And I'm most familiar with ketamine. We actually do retreats for people with ketamine and IFS combined. But I have some experience also with psilocybin and ayahuasca. And a lot of what they do is to kind of put the managers to sleep, which then, when they go to sleep, you access a lot of self automatically. And when you're in that state, it's a big invitation for a lot of your exiles to come in who can't get access to you otherwise because of these protectors. And so in, 15 minutes with somebody, when they're coming back from a ketamine journey, I can do a huge piece of work with their exiles that would take maybe 5 sessions to get to otherwise. That's the big benefit that I see in the combination. I was very skeptical initially when somebody invited me to do it. And I thought, we do fine without that. Yeah, I've been impressed with how much it kind of accelerates the work.
Are there risks?
Yes, there are definitely risks. And so we're very careful about it. So before anybody does the medicine, we spend a number of sessions just asking for permission from their protectors and going over all the fears the protectors have about letting them do this. And if the protectors don't give permission, we just don't have them do it. So the protectors all know in advance what is about to happen. And what we found is as we do that solicitation of the protectors beforehand, people don't have the kind of backlash reactions that occur if you don't get permission. Because, and I found this the hard way, in the early days of doing this work, people would come in and say, I've got this terror, like you just said, and it's in my gut. And I thought, okay, let's go heal that. So I would get them to focus on that and go to that right away. After the session, they'd have these huge backlash reactions. I had a client get into a car accident, just didn't see the car, or leaving my office, or spike a fever, and minimally, these critics would come and attack them for having let this happen. And what I learned was we were bypassing the protectors who spent decades keeping all that contained. And then I walk in and rip open the door, and then they say, oh, screw you, I'm not going to let this person stay with you anymore. And they pull the client out. And so in general, before we go to exiles, before we do psychedelics, we get permission.
There are two questions I always ask in closing. One is there something you were hoping we would get to that we haven't gotten to?
Not a bit. I've loved this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Finally, can you just remind everybody of the name of the new book and any other book you've put out there or any other resources you've put into the universe that we should be aware of?
The new book is called Internal Family Systems Workbook. Let me mention the other two books that just came out that are about IFS I didn't write. And again, one is Ralph de la Rosa, Outshining Trauma. It's a book I like a lot because it's about Buddhism and IFS. And then the other one is Gabrielle Bernstein's new book, which will be out next month, called Self-Help. Both of them, the authors were extremely disclosive about their very troubled pasts, and it's kind of very gripping reading. And then the other book that people like for the public is No Bad Parts, that I wrote about 3 years ago.
Yeah, I've seen it on my wife's bedside. Dick Schwartz, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Really appreciate your time and your work.
Same here, Dan. Really enjoyed it.